This is the mansion on Forsyth Hotel. This is a four-diamond hotel. And the oldest part of it, down ahead of us on the corner on the right there, that was created back in the latter part of the 19th century by a well-known architect named Alfred Eichberg. He was one of the very first Jewish architects to practice here in the state of Georgia. That served today as the restaurant for the mansion. You're going to be seeing another example of the work of Mr. Eichberg just a little bit later on in the tour. An urban forest. Now, you know, many of the trees that we see here in the city today are live oak trees. The live oak is a state tree of Georgia. And if you look over to the left, right here in between these two homes, you're going to get a good look here at one of the most majestic examples that remains here in Savannah, and one of the old live oak trees. That tree right there has been around for at least several hundred years. And believe it or not, that is not the largest one in this area. Now, live oak trees are called that because they pretty much stay green and keep their leaves throughout the year. And they also live for a very, very long time. Now, here to our left on the corner, right across the street, you see another of the big old live oak trees, not quite as large as that one. But you'll notice that this one has got the Spanish moss hanging down. Now, that's a little bit of a misnomer. That stuff is not Spanish, and it's not a moss either. It's actually an air plant. It lives off of the dust and water that's in the air. And it just sort of hangs there on the tree for support. It isn't attached to the tree in any way. And it's also not a parasite, as many people believe. One thing I will caution you though, folks, about the moss. If you happen to see any of it laying around on the ground while you're here with us in Savannah, the best thing that you can do is just leave it alone. Because you see, folks, that moss is full of thousands of little tiny bugs, known as red bugs or chiggers. Not something you want to mess around with.
No chiggers. That's a cute little place.
Now, as you get ready to make the turn, just ahead of us here on the right, you're going to see a big white building here with a white staircase. This is known as a double house. Very popular architectural style here in Savannah back in the 19th century. It's actually two houses in one. And you'll notice that little plaque on the front of that building that says 1881. That, of course, indicates a year that it was built. You see those plaques on many of the homes and buildings in the historic and Victorian parts of Savannah. Now, we said we'd see another example of the work of Mr. Eichberg. It's here on the corner to our right, folks. That was created back in the latter part of the 19th century by Mr. Eichberg. It's also a double house. As you can see, it looks a great deal like the mansion building that we saw a few minutes ago. And down ahead of us here on the corner on the right at the end of the block, we're going to pass a big building here with a tower out in front. That was once the home of the WTOC television station. Now, WTOC stands for Welcome to Our City. They started out here in Savannah back in 1929. As our very first radio station. And in 1954, they switched over and became the very first TV station here in Savannah. Just up in front of us, we're going to be coming into Calhoun Square. This is named after John C. Calhoun, Vice President under both John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. As we enter the square, folks, just ahead of us here on the corner on the right, we're going to be coming up to stop number 5. This is the Massey Heritage Museum. It was originally known as the Massey School. It was the very first public school here in the state of Georgia. Now they still have an old 19th century style classroom on the inside today. And they have a scale model of General Oglethorpe's original plan for the layout of our city. This will be stop number 5. Number 5. You see around it here were created around that same time period. And as you can see, many of these were made using a substance known as Savanna GA Trip. Now that brick was made by slaves on the Hermitage plantation, using clay dredged right up from the bottom of the Savannah River. And of course, folks, being handmade, that makes each brick rather rare and unique. Now there are many people that say if you look carefully at some of the bricks on these homes, on a few of them, you can still see fingerprints. Just ahead of us here on the left, we'll be coming into Whitfield Square. This is named after the Reverend George Whitfield, one of the early pastors at the Christ Church here in Savannah. Also said to be one of the very first traveling evangelists. Now you're most likely aware that Savannah is known throughout the world as a premier destination for weddings. Many people like to come here just to get married. That's what the gazebo in the center of the square is often used for. It was donated to the city by the actor Burt Reynolds when he was here in Savannah filming a movie called Gator back in the 1970s. Just up ahead of us here, we're going to be crossing over Jones Street, named after a Revolutionary War naval hero. Now, Jones Street, folks, you'll see is overhung by some of the big live oak trees. Many of the homes you see here were created back in the mid to late 19th century. And it's been named one of the most premier residential streets in the entire United States. Now straight up in front of us, we'll be coming into Troop Square, named after George McIntosh Troop, one of the early governors of Georgia. But you know, the most interesting thing about this square is its association with one of our most popular holiday songs. Now, I know that you're most likely familiar with a song called Jingle Bells. A lot of people like to sing at Christmas time. But you might not have known that it was actually said to have been written right here in Savannah. It was written back in the 19th century by a man named James Pierpont. Now, back in those days, at one time, Mr. Pierpont was a minister of music at that little church right across the square over to our left. The Universal Unitarian, known to most people in Savannah as the Jingle Bells Church. Now there's always been a little speculation about that. Mr. Pierpont originally was from Bedford, Massachusetts. And a lot of folks up in Bedford believe that he actually wrote Jingle Bells while he was up there in his hometown, sitting in a tavern. But you know, we may actually have had the last word on that issue, because Mr. Pierpont is actually buried right here in Savannah, right out in the old Laurel Grove Cemetery. Now the next square up ahead of us on the left, folks, that is Lafayette Square, named after the Marquis de Lafayette. He was a French general who came over to help out on the American side during the Revolution. The big building on our right here that takes up almost the entire block, that's the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. The only Gothic-style Catholic cathedral here in the state of Georgia. It has beautiful stained glass and wood carving on the inside, imported all the way from Austria. Now, if you're going to be around tomorrow, folks, the cathedral will be open again for tours and for services. This is one many people say that you certainly don't want to miss while you're here with us in Savannah. This will be our stop number 6, the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. 1930s, and that was no Catholics. Now he had about as many military reasons for that as he did religious or cultural. Since his main perceived enemy was the Spanish down in Florida, And since Spain was a Catholic nation, he was afraid if he allowed Catholics among the early settlers and war did break out, that they might side with the Spanish rather than the British. So for that reason, they were prohibited. Now, of course, being a military man, General Oglethorpe did a lot of worrying about the Spanish. He was always afraid they were going to attack Savannah, which they never did. In fact, he wound up going down to St. Augustine down in Florida and attacking them first. As we cross over Liberty Street here, folks, if you look over to the right here, you're going to see an open area there, kind of a green space. This was the old dueling ground here in Savannah. Now, if two gentlemen had a difference of opinion, they could face off there with their pistols and fire away at each other. Now, of course, a lot of times that didn't work out too well for one or even both of them. But in that case, as you can see, they were very conveniently located right next to the cemetery. Now, that is the Colonial Cemetery. Burials took place there from 1750 up until around 1853. Now, the gondola-like structure out towards the center of the cemetery, just over to our right there with the tablet underneath, that is believed to be the burial place of Button Gwinnett, one of the 3 men from Georgia who signed the Declaration of Independence. Now, he messed around, folks, and got himself killed in one of those duels that we were just talking about. He was shot by a man named Lachlan McIntosh, not very long after the beginning of the Revolution. And oddly enough, folks, Lachlan McIntosh is also buried right there in the old Colonial Cemetery, not too far away from his old nemesis, Button Gwinnett. To the left here, folks, as we make the turn, going to get a good look here at Big Duke the Fire Bell. Big Duke here sits right across the street from the Savannah Fire Department. He weighs about 5,500 pounds, and he costs the city of Savannah right around $2,400.
It's not bad.
Right. She was born in that house on Halloween night back in 1860. She founded the Girl Scouts back in 1912. Passed away here in Savannah back in 1927. Now, the house back there where she was born was built for a man named James Moore Wayne. James Moore Wayne was one of the more prominent citizens here back in those days. He served as mayor, also served in the U.S. House of Representatives, and in the 1830s, he was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court by President Andrew Jackson. He served on the court until he passed away back in 1867. He was one of the very few Southern officials who remained in his position in the federal government throughout the course of the Civil War. Many in Savannah refer to it as the bathtub building because of that tile decor that it has. You'll notice on the front, though, folks, that that's actually the federal building here in Savannah. It houses all of the federal offices. And as we make the turn, just up ahead of us here, folks, you're going to be coming into Telfair Square. This was originally named St. James Square when it was first laid out back in the 1730s. It was renamed after the Telfair family back in 1883. Edward Telfair at one time was a governor of Georgia, also a delegate to the Continental Congress. Now, these tents that they're setting up, folks, you can probably see there, they're going to be having the Savannah Book Festival here starting tomorrow and going through the weekend. Most of that's going to take place here in Telfair Square. Across across the square, over on the corner on the left, you're going to be seeing the big yellow building there with some statues out in front. That was the home of Alexander Telfair, who was Edward's son. Alexander had that home designed by that same architect, William J., who also designed the Julia Gordon Low birthplace. Now, when Alexander died, he left that home there to his sister, the very same Mary Telfair that we mentioned earlier down by Forsyth Park. Now, Mary had no problem, as we said, giving things away, but when she did like to attach stipulations. And the stipulations she attached to this building, when she died, she wanted it to become an art museum. So upon her death, it went to the Georgia Historical Society. And it did, in fact, become the very first public art museum here in the southeast part of the United States.
Where did she get all the money?
Well, they inherited their money from their father. Edward Telfair was, he was a very wealthy man here back in the middle part of the 19th century. He made most of his money from, of course, from shipping and the cotton industry. Now, just up in front of us here, folks, are going to be coming up to Bay Street. Now, Bay Street is named for its position overlooking the Savanna River, right off to the other side. The river down there at this end of Bay Street is actually one of the narrowest parts of the Savanna River. And that's associated with one of the more unique stories that is part of the history of Savannah. Way back in December of 1864, when General Sherman and his army were approaching the city, he sent a message to General Hardee, who was in charge of the Confederate troops here in Savannah. And he told General Hardee that he might just as well go ahead and surrender. Now, General Hardee sent a message right back to General Sherman, informing him that he had no intention of surrendering, that he would stand and defend the city. But you see, folks, what General Sherman didn't know was that General Hardee was really just trying to buy time. He already knew that he was in a very bad position. So he sent his men, the Confederate troops, to building a pontoon bridge. Now, of course, there was no bridge across the Savannah River back in those days, so they had to build one. They used wagon wheels, barrels, crates, anything they could find that would float. Now, once they had that bridge built, it took about a day and a half to get all of the men and horses and wagons and everything else across the river and over to South Carolina. Once they got there, they cut the bridge loose and they let it float away. So, Confederate troops, only civilians here in the city. Now, since it was almost Christmas time, and since he did find no armed opposition here in Savannah, he decided not to burn the city, as of course he had already done to many others during his famous March to the Sea. To Johnson Square. This is named after Robert Johnson. He was the royal governor of South Carolina back when the colony here in Savannah was founded. Johnson Square, folks, is the oldest and the largest of the squares here in the city. At one time, the public well and the public oven were located right here in this square. And it was also here back in 1776 that the Declaration of Independence was read out loud to the people here in Savannah for the very first time. Now, back in 1976, they also held the bicentennial celebration here in the square. The entertainment that evening was Kate Smith singing God Bless America and the Preservation Hall Jazz Band right here in Johnson Square. Now, the big monument on our left in the center of the square, that commemorates General Nathaniel Greene. General Greene was second in command to George Washington during the Revolution. And he is actually buried right there in the center of the square, right under the monument, along with one of his sons. Now, folks, after the war was over, General Greene was granted Mulberry Grove Plantation, which is not very far from Savannah, as part of his reward for his war service. But you know, folks, he was from Rhode Island, and he really wasn't very familiar with the kind of weather that we can have here in Savannah, especially in the summertime. Now, he went out riding around one day without his hat, and as a result, he wound up passing away from a heat stroke. Now, that left behind his wife, Katie, and 4 young children there on the plantation. And to help her educate the children, she hired a tutor, a young man from Yale University. Now, while he was there on the plantation, he wound up inventing a device that was destined to have a tremendous impact on the history of the South, and ultimately the entire nation. Now, of course, folks, I'm talking about the cotton gin. And that young man's name was Eli Whitney. Right now we're coming into Wright Square, named after James Wright. He was the 3rd and last of the colonial governors of Georgia. The big monument on our left, here in the center of the square, that commemorates a man named William Washington Gordon. Mr. Gordon was the president and founder of the Central of Georgia Railroad back in the 1850s. But he's much, much better known today to most people as the grandfather of Juliet Gordon Low, the founder of the Girl Scouts. That comes from Stone Mountain up near Atlanta, and it commemorates the Miko, or chief of the Yamacraw Indians. His name was Tomachichi. He and the Yamacraw were here to greet General Oglethorpe and the settlers when they arrived here back in the 1730s. He actually became a very, very good friend of the general. He got to go with him back to England and meet the king and the queen. And when Tomachichi died and was buried back there in the center of Wright Square, one of the pallbearers at his funeral was, in fact, General Oglethorpe. Oglethorpe Square, also named after our founder, like many things here in Savannah that you've already seen. And if you look across the square, over on the corner to the left there, you're going to see a big building there with green and white trim. That's the Owens Thomas House. Now that's another one of the homes that was designed here in Savannah by William J. back in the early part of the 19th century. That house has 24-inch thick walls and natural heating and lighting. And it was also the first home in the city to have running water. They actually had it even before the White House. Now you'll notice as we come by it, folks, a big staircase going up to the front door. That is known as an open arm staircase. Very popular back in the 19th century. Now that type of staircase allowed the ladies to go into that house by one side and the gentlemen by the other. Very popular custom back in those days. Now, if you're going by Leopold's Ice Cream, Leopold's is one of the old soda fountains, dates all the way back to the 1920s here in Savannah. Next to it is the marquee of the Old Wise Theater. The Wise opened in 1946. And it's one of the old movie palaces. It seats about 1,100 people on the inside. Owned and operated today by the Savannah College of Art and Design. As a master builder. This is one of the homes here in Savannah that has been restored by the Historic Savannah Foundation. They started out here back in the 1950s. They're responsible for much of the preservation we see here today. This is our stop number 8. In front of us here, folks, named after the mythical figure often said to watch over the United States. Now the big fountain to our left here in the center of the square, that is known as the Wormslow Fountain. It was donated by the descendants of Noble Jones. He was one of the wealthiest and most well-known of the original settlers here in Savannah. And he owned a plantation called the Wormslow Plantation, located not very far from the city in an area known today as the Isle of Hope. That is one of the very few 18th century style plantations that is still open today for visitors. This building on our right here, folks, with all the flags, that is the Webb Military Museum. That showcases the military history of the city of Savannah, going all the way back as far as the Civil War. Now, as we come into Green Square here, folks, the reason we were listening to Dr. King, if you look to the left here as we enter the square, down on the corner there, you're going to see a big half-brick building with a cross attached to it. That is the Second African Baptist Church. Dates all the way back to 1802. Now, back in 1963, Dr. King visited Savannah, and he delivered a sermon from right there in the Second African. They say that on that morning, he went through a sort of a dry run, a rehearsal, if you will, of the speech that he was going to give a little bit later on that year up on the Mall in Washington, D.C. Now also, back in January of 1865, when General Sherman and his army were here in Savannah, he met with a group of freed slaves right there in the Second African. And it was from right there that he issued his famous Field Order Number 15, which granted 40 acres and a mule to any freed slaves. Coming into stop number 9, which will be the Pirate's House restaurant. The Pirate's House dates clear back to the 1750s. Was once used as an inn and a tavern for pirates and sailors passing through Savannah. This is back in the 1730s, and that was no strong drink or strong water. What the general meant by that was hard liquor. Now, he did allow the consumption of beer and ale and wine by the early settlers, but he was afraid that the use of rum and brandy, as he referred to it, might very well have a bad effect on the social and economic development of the colony. So for that reason, that stuff was prohibited. This area to our right, folks, that was originally known as Yamacraw Bluff. Now, this is where the early settlers landed when they arrived here, back in the 1730s. This is known today as Emmett Park. Now, there are a couple of monuments here in the park I would like to point out to you. The white monument ahead of us on the right there, folks, that is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It commemorates 106 soldiers from Savannah who died in the Vietnam War. And just beyond that, also on the right, is the Celtic Cross that commemorates the Irish immigrants here in Savannah. Now, when you mention the Irish, of course, that also brings up St. Patrick's Day. And I know that many of you are probably aware that that's a huge event here in Savannah. We have about the third largest St. Patrick's Day celebration of any city here in the United States. Now, folks, they do have a great big parade on that day. Many people like to wear green clothes and even dye their hair green. But you know, on the day after St. Patrick's Day, you also see a lot of people walking around with green faces. That's when they wish that General Oglethorpe's prohibition was still in effect. Now, as we make our way on down to River Street, you'll notice that we're going to have a little bit of a bumpy ride. That's because we're traveling over what is known as cobblestones. Although in this case, what these actually are ballast stones. Now, back in the 18th century, when ships headed this way from England, they usually came empty. And they used these stones to help balance the ship on the way over. So when they got here, they unloaded the stones and they loaded up with cargo. Then they turned around and headed right on back. Now, around this next corner here, folks, we'll be coming up to stop number 10. This will be our only stop down here on River Street. International Trade and Convention Center. The brown building next to it is the Westin Hotel. Both of those were built back in the early 1990s. Now, way back in the 1730s, when the early settlers first arrived here, the river right around this area was only about 12 feet deep. But as you can well imagine, over the years, as bigger and bigger ships have been entering the harbor, it's now been stretched out to its current depth out there in the channel of about 43 feet. Now, that land that we see right on the other side of the river, that is not South Carolina, as many people believe. That's actually known as Hutchinson Island, and is still part of the city of Savannah and the state of Georgia. Now, there is another river called the Back River that sits right on the other side of Hutchinson Island. South Carolina actually begins just on the other side of that. Now, up ahead of us on the left here, folks, are going to be passing by a statue of a young lady and a dog. That is the famous Florence artist, the Waving Girl, and her dog Sandy. That statue there was created by Felix de Weldon, who also created the Iwo Jima Memorial up in Washington, D.C. Now, also, folks, on our left here, you'll notice the Olympic cauldron. That was used when the Olympic yachting events were held here in Savannah back in 1996 during the Atlanta Olympics. Now, just to get back to Florence Martis, the Waving Girl, there for a second. Florence lived with her brother, who was a lighthouse keeper, a few miles down the river at a spot known as Elba Island. Now, they say that back when she was about 19 years old, that Florence had a young man who had promised to marry her. But he told her before they got married that he wanted to head out to sea and seek his fortune. So he left, and he told Florence to watch for his ship to return, and that just as soon as he came back, that they would be married. Now, Florence, of course, took him at his word on that. She proceeded to stand out there every day and wave at every ship that came in and out of the harbor, hoping that that young man might be aboard. Now, they say during the daytime that she would wave a towel or an old piece of blanket, as depicted in the statue. And at night, of course, she would wave a lantern. Now, the legend goes that she stood out there every day for 44 years, waved at every ship that came and went. But after all those years, that young man never returned, and she never did wind up getting married. Now, you know, folks, I have to tell you, I think I just would have given up and moved on. Yeah. But Florence apparently was a very, very persistent person. Maybe even a little bit too persistent.
Maybe that's why he didn't come back.
Could be. Now, in front of us here, folks, we're coming into Warren Square. This is named after General Joseph Warren. He was a medical doctor and a brigadier general back during the Revolutionary War. He was killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill. But you know, the sad part about that story, when General Warren died in that battle, he was only about 34 years old. And he had only been a general for a grand total of about 3 days. Now, back around the time of the Revolution, right around 1776, Savannah was showing signs of becoming a very, very prosperous colony. Now, there were a great many wealthy families here in the city, and old stately colonial homes, which of course was mostly owing to the shipping trade. Now, a lot of folks today wonder how come we don't see many of the old 18th century style homes on the tour. The answer is, like many cities here in the United States over the years, Savannah has suffered from a number of devastating fires. Now, the worst one of all happened back in 1796, and it started up ahead of us about 2 or 3 blocks in the old city market in Ellis Square, before it ended about 2/3 of Savannah had actually burned down. Now, around this next corner here, folks, you're going to be coming in to stop number 11. This will be convenient to Bay Street in front of us, Reynolds Square right behind us. This is stop number 11. green roof on top. That houses the old city exchange bell. Now that bell there dates all the way back to 1802. And they once used to ring it to signal to shopkeepers here in Savannah that it was just about time to go ahead and close up for the end of the business day. Now folks, this does bring us up here to stop number 12, convenient to the Hyatt and Bohemian hotels, also to Factor's Walk, just over to our